Winter is my favorite season of the year. There's just something about the feeling of snow falling and the holiday spirit that puts me in a good mood all throughout. However, living in a fairly cold state often brings heavy snowfall during these winter months. Being a part-time DoorDash driver for almost 3 years at the time, I found this job much more difficult during winter. The roads would take a while to get plowed, and even when they did, the heavy snowfall would quickly cover them again. While it made the job dangerous and sometimes impossible, I still chose to drive on days of heavy snow and covered roads. The reason? Fewer people would be out and other DoorDash drivers would likely stay home, giving me access to more orders and the potential to make more money. Plus, customers tended to tip better, knowing they were asking a lot by ordering deliveries during a blizzard. It was the middle of December when a night of heavy snowfall came around. I couldn't start deliveries until 7 or 8 because of my other job, but as soon as I could, I began driving like usual. The roads were nearly empty, and my DoorDash app was offering high-paying deliveries. After completing 2 relatively quick orders, I was on my way back from a house when the snowfall worsened. The visibility was awful, and the roads weren't being plowed often enough. My car wasn't a piece of junk. It had all-wheel drive and all-season tires, but this snow was really making it struggle. At a stop sign, my tires spun under me before I could get moving again. After finally passing through the intersection, another order popped up on my phone. I hesitated, debating whether or not to take it, before ultimately rejecting it. The roads were simply too dangerous, even for me. The specific street I was on wasn't far from the main town, so I aimed to get closer, hoping more snowplows had cleared the roads. I drove cautiously, going 20 in a 45 miles per hour zone. As I rolled through the poor conditions, I barely noticed something large in the middle of the road ahead. By the time I saw it, it was too late. I slammed on the brakes. My car stopped in time, but the back tires slid out, dragging my vehicle off the road and into a thick layer of snow. Thankfully, it was a soft, low-speed crash, but my car was completely stuck. I gathered myself, stayed calm, turned on my hazard lights, and called for roadside assistance. After giving my location, the man on the other end said it would take 15 to 20 minutes for him to arrive. Relieved, I thanked him and leaned back in my seat, happy I hadn't accepted another order. A few minutes passed as I watched the snowfall. Then, I noticed a flickering light in my side mirror. It was faint but grew brighter as it approached. A vehicle with orange caution lights pulled up behind me. It had only been 4 minutes since my call, so I assumed the help was unusually early. After a couple of minutes, I heard a door slam shut. A man walked toward my window. Once he was a few feet away, I rolled it down slightly. "Hi, sir. Did you need assistance?" he asked. "Yes, I called a few minutes ago. I just need help getting back on the road," I replied. Though the situation was obvious, explaining myself felt a bit strange. "Right. Let me see what I can do for you," he said, walking to the back of my car. I assumed he was inspecting the vehicle to attach a hook, likely to use a winch to pull it out. But after a moment, I saw him open my trunk in the rearview mirror. "Sorry," he muttered, slamming the trunk shut. It was odd. I couldn't think of any reason why he needed to open my trunk. My suspicion grew. I quickly called the roadside assistance number again. After a few rings, the same man from before picked up. "Hey, I'm just a couple minutes away. Did you need something else?" My stomach dropped. Just then, the man at my window said, "I need your keys, and I need you to exit the vehicle for a minute while I prepare it." Keeping the phone to my ear, I awkwardly told him I needed a moment as I was on a call. He stood silently, staring at me. My panic rose. I rolled up the window, locked the doors, and ignored his knocking. His tone grew aggressive. "What are you doing?" he demanded, trying to open my door. Suddenly, I heard another door slam shut behind me. Another man was running toward my car, holding something in his hand. Before I could react, a deafening horn blared behind us. Bright lights flooded the area as the real roadside assistance truck arrived. The two men fled in their vehicle, speeding off into the snowy night. Two workers from the truck approached me, making sure I was okay. They'd heard everything from the call I'd accidentally left connected and rushed to help. Later, the police told me there had been multiple reports of similar incidents. During heavy snowfalls, these men would stage accidents and prey on stranded drivers, pretending to be roadside assistants. I'm grateful for how things turned out that night, but the experience left me shaken, and I doubt I'll ever drive in such dangerous conditions again. My family and I would go up north to go ice fishing when I was younger. My parents had friends who owned some cabins in pretty much the middle of nowhere. There was a small gas station about a mile away, but beyond that, it would take about 20 to 30 minutes to reach anything else. On our way up, snow was starting to fall, and I just wanted to get settled in and play some games. It was an 8-hour drive to get to our destination, and we arrived around 4 p.m. It was January, so the sun was already starting to set, and I was pretty tired. We pulled into our cabin's parking lot and began unloading. The cabins had smart locks, so all we needed to do was enter the code, and it would provide the key to unlock the door. I grabbed my backpack and suitcase and went to enter the code, but I noticed tracks leading up to the door. I told my dad, and he said it was probably the cleaning person or someone from earlier. Taking his word for it, I unlocked the door. Walking inside, I noticed a bit of water on the floor. Again, I assumed it was from the cleaning person. Other than that, everything looked fine and just as I remembered it. I went to the room I always stayed in and began unpacking. When I went to close the blinds on the window, I noticed tracks again. This time, they looked like they were coming from the woods and leading up toward our cabin. Judging by the snowfall, they had to be fresh. I told my dad, and he said he would check it out. By the time we had finished unloading, the snowfall had intensified, almost turning into a blizzard. My dad assured me if anyone was out there, they're definitely not anymore if they're smart. He made SpaghettiOs for me and my mom, and we watched a movie before I went to bed. I was awoken a few hours later by a thumping sound on the wall. It sounded like it was coming from outside my window. At first, I tried to go back to sleep, but the sound persisted, happening a few more times. At this point, I wasn't scared, just annoyed. I got up and checked outside the window, but I saw nothing. The snow had let up a bit, so visibility was better. However, I noticed the tracks again, almost in the same place as before, coming from the woods and leading right up to our cabin. I made sure the windows were locked before going back to bed, knowing there wasn't much else I could do. The next day, I told my dad about the tracks. He seemed skeptical, but we went outside together to check. Sure enough, there were human footsteps leading from the woods to our cabin, stopping at my bedroom window, and then continuing to the front door before heading back to the woods. We had been to this cabin many times before, and we knew that besides the cabin itself, there was nothing for miles around. No one ever camped in these woods, especially during the winter. My dad called his friends to tell them about it, but no one could figure out what was going on. A few hours later, my dad's friends brought over some mini cameras. These cameras plugged into the wall and provided a live feed of the house. We set them up inside to make us feel safer. It was a hassle, but better safe than sorry. Later that day, we headed to the lake to go ice fishing. My mom constantly checked the cameras on her phone to make sure no one else was inside the cabin. When we arrived at the lake, we left our phones in the car and spent a few hours fishing. When we returned to the car, my mom had multiple notifications about the camera's sensing movement. My dad immediately called his friend to check the cabin or notify the police. His friend stayed on the line while entering the house with some type of gun. After a few tense minutes of silence, his friend said nothing was there. I know he should have waited for the police, but my dad's friends are just a different breed. Even so, he called the police to report the incident. Unfortunately, the cameras didn't save footage, only live feeds, so we had no video proof. We stayed with my dad's friend for the next few nights but left the cameras up in the cabin. On the day we were leaving, the cameras detected movement again. My dad and his friend rushed to the cabin, but again, nothing was inside. However, there were fresh tracks leading from the woods to the cabin, just like before. My dad considered following the tracks, but my mom urged him not to. It was eerie to think someone might have been inside while we were sleeping or watching us through the windows during the day. Thankfully, nothing ever came of it, and we were safe. Still, it was one of the creepiest experiences of my life. The next few times we went up north, we stayed in a different cabin, and nothing strange happened. My dad's friends said they never figured out what was going on at that particular cabin, and the person, whoever it was, seemed to stop coming after we left. To this day, the memory still gives me chills. My uncle had offered me the opportunity to look after his house while he went on vacation with his family in Europe. My aunt and cousin had already left ahead of him, while my uncle stayed behind to finish up some business. Once he wrapped everything up, he asked me to take care of the house for a few weeks. Knowing how much I had always wanted to experience living alone, he saw this as the perfect opportunity for me. However, he laid down some strict rules. He forbade me from inviting any friends over or hanging out in the yard too much. I didn't quite understand why, but I assumed he didn't want me wandering outside where the large amounts of accumulated snow could lead to an accident. After giving me several detailed instructions about maintaining the house, he left me with a fully stocked refrigerator and went on his way. At first, I must admit it was better than I expected. I didn't feel uncomfortable being alone. In fact, I felt a sense of freedom, as though I could finally do whatever I wanted. Everything was going perfectly until the middle of the night. A noise woke me up, more surprised than scared. I quickly got out of bed and looked around. The room was empty, illuminated only by the intense moonlight streaming through the window. I glanced outside to see if it was snowing. To my surprise, not only was snow falling, but a full-blown blizzard had started. I stared outside, mesmerized by the storm, completely unaware of what was actually happening. Suddenly, I heard the same noise again, this time coming from the front door downstairs. My heart began pounding as fear crept in. At first, I thought maybe something had blown against the door in the wind, but I wasn't sure. I cautiously went downstairs, turning on every light along the way. Peeking through the peephole of the front door, I saw nothing. Still on edge, I cracked the door open slightly, careful not to let in the cold air or snow. To my horror, I saw footprints leading straight to the door. Panic set in as I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breathing quick and shallow. Who the hell would be outside in this weather? I muttered under my breath. My mind raced as I scanned the house for my next move. I ran to the back door and peered through the glass. The storm made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, but through the swirling snow, I spotted a figure. It looked like a small child, no older than 9 or 10, walking away from the house. A brief lull in the wind allowed me to see more clearly, and sure enough, there was definitely a kid out there. Fear mixed with concern. I worried about the child's safety but didn't know how to approach the situation. I ran upstairs, grabbed my phone, and called 911 to report the strange occurrence. Returning to the back window, I kept watch, but the child had vanished into the snowy darkness. When the police arrived, I explained the situation in detail. As we stood in the kitchen discussing what had happened, A soft knock came from the front door. The officers exchanged glances before one of them told me to stay put. They approached the door cautiously. When the door opened, standing there was the child from earlier. One of the officers brought him inside, clearly concerned. The boy wasn't wearing a thick jacket or proper winter gear, just a light sweatshirt. The other officer stepped outside to search the area but soon returned, closing the door behind him. The boy's expression was unsettling. His face was blank, devoid of any emotion, as if he weren't fully present. The officer asked him several questions, where his parents were, what he was doing out in the storm, but the boy barely spoke. He seemed lost, not just physically but mentally. The surreal scene left me rattled. Who walks around in a blizzard at night, let alone a child? Why had he knocked on my door? And why was he alone and so expressionless? Weeks passed before we got any answers, though they only raised more questions. By the time the boy finally spoke to investigators, my uncle had returned home, and my duties as a house-sitter were over. The boy claimed the house, my uncle's house, was where he lived. 2 weeks later, a family positively identified the boy as their missing child, who had vanished months earlier. I kept following the story, unable to shake the strange events. Things only got weirder. Less than a month later, while my uncle was on vacation again, another missing child was found sitting in the street outside his house. The authorities claimed there was no connection between the two cases, but it felt too coincidental. I started questioning everything. Why had my uncle forbidden me from having visitors or going outside too much? Why had he left several days after his family? Could he have been hiding something I didn't know about? Of course, I could just be overthinking. The police had searched the house after the first boy was found, and my uncle had cooperated fully. Maybe it truly was an eerie coincidence. Or maybe it wasn't. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right.